Hi folks, and welcome to another edition of Government Matters. My name is Mike Dobbs, I'm your host, and once again we have the opportunity of talking to our Congressman Richard Neal, about what's happening in Washington. And I want to tell you, my list of questions, it wasn't I was straining for questions, I was straining to edit the questions out because there's so much happening right now in Congress. Let me just thank you for coming in, first of all,
Pleased to be
as
here.
always. Let's talk about, you just sent out a press release about the expansion of the child tax credit. Let's talk a little bit about that, because this sounds like this would be a no-brainer that you would want to extend this.
Well, extend and expand. I think that's the better description. In the American Rescue Package, despite all the talk that we heard from what we call the other body, despite all the talk that we heard from advocates, I put in an expanded child tax credit in the rescue package, and it worked famously. We constructed that child credit on the basis of joint filers being able to qualify inside of $400,000 in terms of income. We did that, Mike, because we, as Democrats, always get caught in the argument, we're taking it away from this one to give to that one. It's always kind of sort of amorphous, though. It's never who you're really doing it with. You know what I mean? It's a very general description. And I pushed hard and spoke with the president at the time and said, I think this is the time to do it, Mr. President. It worked, as I said, very, very well. Our idea was that we needed, in the American Rescue Package and subsequent legislation, a path to getting money into the hands of people at the lower end of the economic spectrum for cash flow purposes. So in terms of credit history, we use community banks, CDFIs, and credit unions, people that had a history. We went so far on the health side because there are a lot of people that don't have to file taxes because they don't make enough income. So how did we get the benefit to them in terms of the child credit? We went back and traced Medicaid records. And my point is that it worked. The Republicans won the House afterwards, though not nearly by the number they anticipated they were going to.
Right.
And they decided to let it lapse. So the debate that we had last week in Washington in the Ways and Means Committee was actually pretty simple. I led the argument for expanding the credit again on a substantial basis. And I was open to suggestions about just what the term substantial means, but clearly enhancing the credit and expanding it for people at the lower end. Based upon efficiency and electronic deposit, it worked well. We wanted it, or I wanted it to be refundable, meaning that it would be deposited every month or biweekly, as opposed to what happens now, and that is during the refundability period, you wait till people file their taxes. And I thought the cash flow should be based more on a monthly prediction. And Republicans resisted the idea of a big expansion. There is a modest expansion in the child credit. There were a series of trade-offs that you have to make. The low-income housing tax credit was included at my request, and I pushed pretty hard on that. We did some R&D credit, which is very important to Massachusetts, important here in the Valley, as a matter of fact, about investors taking risk. And we thought at the time that some of these trade-offs made some sense, including the double taxation of products that come from Taiwan, which will not kick in until Taiwan relinquishes some of their purposes. So in legislative life, you make choices. And if the good becomes the enemy of the perfect, you're going to find yourself at a standstill. And we decided at the end, I think 15 of the 18 Democrats on the committee, we decided to support an expanded credit. Was it what we wanted? No. Was it a bad deal? It certainly was not. And it'll be difficult now to see whether or not they can get this through the Senate, because right now Republicans in the United States Senate and Republicans in the United States House of Representatives, they don't seem to care much for each other based upon a lot of ideological positions. And it's really been a pretty paltry level of accomplishment that has come from Republicans in the House. We voted 740 times last year, much of it on who was going to be the Speaker of the House.
Yes,
And
that's
now
true.
when you consider that, when you look back at that, that bad decision that Speaker McCarthy made to allow one person to motion to vacate the chair, it would not be a surprise if we had a series more of those votes about the current Speaker of the House. They are allowing a fringe of their own party to hold the Speaker of the House and the institution hostage to demands that cannot be met by Democrats for sure. And when you have, as I pointed out to the chairman of our committee, when he talked to me about his plan, I pointed out to him that you have a 2-vote majority now in the House. We have a 2-vote majority in the Senate, and we are now into a presidential cycle. It is unlikely that you're going to have these vast victories, but that does not stop the idea of some incremental victories that are good for the American family.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about one of the hot button issues that we're hearing in the House, and that is, of course, border security with money to Ukraine and Israel. The Supreme Court's recent decision about saying that the federal government had the rights to remove the razor wire along the border that Governor Abbott had put up. That's almost sort of is a side note to this bigger controversy about what can be done at the border, how much it is going to cost, and then at the same time, do we still want to fight Putin? I mean, do we still want to help Ukraine in its war against Russia? And it, from my viewpoint, sitting in Springfield, Massachusetts, it looks like nothing much is that you're talking about standstill. From your point, actually being there, is there any room to wiggle toward a compromise that would hopefully, A, address border security and certainly address the needs of our allies?
Yes, and I am in favor of supporting Ukraine. We should not be naive about Russia and its expansionist policies. Crimea comes to mind.
Yep.
Now Ukraine. If you interact with any of those who formerly were held under the yoke of Marxism in the old Soviet Union, they have no desire in Bulgaria or Romania or Poland or Lithuania, Latvia, or Estonia to go back to Russian domination. And this is the greater Russia that Putin promised when he became president for life. So I'm in favor of coming to the aid of the Ukrainian people, as is Europe, as is NATO, our longtime allies. And I think that the deal could come along the lines of aid to Israel, aid to Taiwan, which is now facing, again, almost a Hong Kong situation.
Right.
Where they're being threatened every day by a Chinese government that seems hell-bent on returning Taiwan to what they believe is its rightful position as part of mainland China. And so you have Taiwan, you have Israel, and you have Ukraine, and I think a trade-off on the border can be done. So my guess is that I do not favor open borders. The number one responsibility of the federal government is national security. You can't have 1 million people walking across the border and not knowing who they are. I also favor a path to citizenship. I think that the plan that the president is currently negotiating, that is playing out in the United States Senate, might have some merit. But let me say something, because you follow politics pretty closely. There are a lot of Republicans who feel that if you get an agreement on the border now, it takes the issue away from Donald Trump in the presidential election cycle. So there are times in Washington, let's be frank, where people want the issue rather than a solution.
Right.
Because they want to take it to the election cycle. Now, that's maybe a Machiavellian approach to this, but let's not be naive about the president's posture on this. He, right now, favors some sort of a solution to the border crisis because it is a crisis.
You bring up this point, and that is the idea that we talk about it and talk about it and talk about it, but if there's a solution, you're right. It's going to take a talking point away from Donald Trump and Nikki Haley. If they actually see allies of theirs in the House and Senate say, we've come to a conclusion that this would be something we can both support, then for them, what are they going to do? Are they going to criticize fellow Republicans for coming to a compromise that tries to solve these problems? Or are they, are they just going to have to find something else to talk about?
Well, I mean, let's be candid about something, and that is that when I went to Washington and during my career in politics, I really believed, and still do, that your career ought to be based on the merit of what you've achieved, what you've gotten done. That's the big thing. I marched that Ways and Means Committee through the pandemic, through the largest trade agreement that was supported by 195 Democrats and 194 Republicans, the CARES Act, the Pandemic Relief Package, the American Rescue Package, the Infrastructure Bill, the CHIPS Act, and the multi-employer pension plan issue. And generally, because you're not driving conflict 24 hours a day, that is not measured by the same yardstick that it once was. So today, it's more about sharpening your credential by going to social media, going to your favorite cable show, and believing that the cable show that you're choosing to go on to espouse your message really has something to do with legislative achievement.
Right.
And I think that the difference is that I've marked a career by doing things. So I come down on the side of rejecting the former president's position that immigration poisons the blood of America. I have immigrant grandparents. They didn't poison the blood of America. They sent 9 children to the military between them, 2 families. They paid their taxes every day. They were good citizens. And I think that for Trump to have taken the position that he's taken on the border has been reckless. I'm not sure he wants a solution right now because he would rather have the issue going into November.
Right. And just expand a little bit, especially since there's been news reports about the fact that in the Senate there is a compromise idea about border security and continued aid to our allies. And I heard one report that the Senate plan may not even fly in the House because Republican House members won't like this idea of this compromise and trying to do something to move these two major issues forward.
So let me take you a bit into the weeds on this issue. We need immigration in America. Employers need immigrants. They have changed and transformed the meatpacking houses of the Midwest. They work hard where they can secure worker visas. In addition, they become more patriotic than just about anybody else because of the opportunity when they contrast it as to where they're coming from. The problem that we have with immigration is that it's now been turned into a demagogic issue. And part of that is because of the breakdown in the processes of immigration. And if I talk to an Italian barber, used to be a German chef, a Russian tailor, they will all say the same thing. They were immigrants who came through a process. And I think that that's what we ought to yearn for. So those Republicans in the House, who, by the way, I don't think they're even in favor of good weather, if they think that it would harm their prospects in November. Again, I'm not sure they want a solution. And I think the danger here is that the more complicated part of this is demographics. It's related to destiny. The average family is having 1.8 children per family. Now, I know biologically that doesn't make a lot of sense, but statistically it confirms what I've just said, and that is that our birth rate in America, by the way, across the Western democracies as well, and now on to China. And I think the example that would come to mind for America is that the stagnation that the Japanese economy witnessed now for 25 years has much to do with birth rates.
I think it's I think it's an amazing topic, an amazing issue, mainly because this country is a nation of immigrants. And when you realize that there are so many jobs, entry-level jobs in all sorts of different fields that a lot of Americans really don't want, but we need to have them done. This is where someone coming to this country that wants to start a life here, this is their door into American economics, the door into American culture. Personally, I think it's just part of our national culture.
It's part of our DNA.
To have immigrants coming in.
Well, how would Cape Cod function without immigration? How would Berkshire County function without immigrant labor? And what's interesting about it is that, all right, let's strike a deal if we have to on work visas. If people want to cross the border on a daily basis and go to work and go back at night, it's okay too. I think that as long as you know who's coming in and how they're being attended, and by the way, you want to make sure that the dignity of work is rewarded as well. You don't want them to be taken advantage of. So that's another part of knowing who's in the country, because then labor standards have to be adhered to.
Right. Talking about the House, I was fascinated with the election of Congressman Mike Johnson to Speaker. Some of the quotes I've read from him and about him have been a little bit concerning to me. ABC News did, I'm just going to quote from a report they did on January 20th. It says, approaching his first 100 days on the job, Johnson faces daunting choices ahead. He can try to corral conservatives who are pushing rightward in endless hours of closed-door meetings to work together as a team, or he can keep reaching out to Democrats for a bipartisan coalition to pass compromise legislation. And it goes on to basically says he seems to be willing to work with the Democrats, but on the other side is whether or not his hardcore fellow Republicans are going to accept that. Have you had dealings with him? I mean, I'm sure that you have, but I'm just wondering what your sense is about all this.
You're mistaken. I've never met him.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
And I would say that was probably true of 75% of the Democrats in the House of Representatives. I probably saw him in the hallway and waved or something akin to that.
Right.
I think that when he was chosen, it came out of nowhere. And I have been correct so far in the sense that I've said that he was going to get more room than McCarthy had with his own party, largely because of the fact that a lot of religious conservatives, which make up a large portion of the Republican caucus in the House of Representatives, they see him as being one of them.
Right.
And I think that they did not see McCarthy in the same vein. And so I think that there's also this reality that you get a little bit of an opportunity. But let me predict something flatly. He will not pass any of these spending bills without Democratic help.
Right.
And it's likely that when he decides to embrace Democratic help, there's going to be a lot of angst on his own side amongst that 20 that are not in favor of anything. So they can't pass these bills on their own. We're not going to pass bills that arbitrarily cut necessary and needed initiatives in America. And they are so far now outside of the mainstream as to what they propose. They're just against everything. And I think that Speaker Johnson, he has attempted to avoid a threat to his speakership by challenging the chair, while simultaneously he knows this, even though he was not around at the time. What Bill Clinton did to Newt Gingrich over the government shutdown,
right.
What Barack Obama did to John Boehner over the government shutdown, that is on the mind of Speaker Johnson. They cannot win a government shutdown, and when you talk to Republicans in the House, the few moderates that are left, they will tell you they know they cannot win a government shutdown. And if they try to shut the government down, it will be of enormous help politically to Joe Biden.
Wow. Well, you can see how ignorant I am. I would have figured that the Speaker of the House would have introduced himself to every House member and maybe had a conversation.
I think we were all stunned when he was chosen because most of us had no idea who he was. Generally, the speakership, as is the quest for a committee chairpersonship, which is, by the way, the quest that brings about Oscar nominations and Pulitzer Prizes and gold medals in the Olympics. It's about ambition.
Right.
But you have to stay for a while inside of the institution once you eye up what your long-term prospects are. And I think in the case of Johnson, Speaker of the House after 8 years in the House, unheard of.
Normally, with that situation, you would think that this guy is a wonder kid. You know, I mean, that he's...
I don't think anybody would describe him that way.
Okay.
I think more caretaker.
Right. State House News reported this week that a Massachusetts panel on Monday unanimously denied an effort to remove former President Donald Trump's name from the Republican presidential primary ballot. The State Ballot Law Commission dismissed a challenge that alleged Trump is ineligible for office because of his role with January 6th, which is now, of course, Maine is involved with that. A couple western states are involved with that. As much as you are a long-term congressman, you are also a historian. And I was wondering how a historian would react to the concept of states trying to remove a candidate from the ballot, especially for the reasons cited, even though he has not yet gone through all of the legal stuff about January 6th that we're waiting for him to go through.
Well, first of all, it's an iffy prospect in court. So the Supreme Court's going to hear the case. But secondly, as Democrats, we acknowledge Donald Trump needs to be defeated. And there is some evidence that his base is solidified around the idea of him presenting victimhood, that
Right.
he's being picked upon. And the other number that I hope that you and I will have a chance to talk about later on in the year that you can hold me to, when you look at polling data, people look at polling data and they look at the glare of the headline as opposed to drilling down into how the questions were asked, what were asked, who the numbers were, when they were questioned, and also their voting patterns. You want to find out, I mean, you know, somebody that says, for example, well, I'm an independent, and they're asked, well, what ballot did you ask for in the last election? And you say a Republican ballot, and the election before that a Republican ballot, and the election before that a Republican ballot. We know what?
Right.
You're not really an independent. So you have to go through and cull the details of the polling data. But the number that has stood out for me since last week in the Iowa caucuses, that 30% of the Republicans who participated in the Iowa caucuses said that if Donald Trump is convicted of a crime in the 91 felony counts that he is facing, that would cause them not to vote for him. That is a huge number. Even though 70% of the Republicans said they would vote for him anyway,
Right.
30% not voting for him would be like what I would describe as the country club Republicans, the Charlie Baker type Republicans. And even yesterday, as I was listening to some numbers on a poll from New York State, which got my attention, was that even though independent voters were not crazy about Joe Biden, in the state of New York, 70% of them said that they would prefer him to Donald Trump. So if you look at the statistical data in Massachusetts, which is pretty compelling, a lot of people haven't paid a lot of attention to it yet, but it's gripping. 60% of the registered voters now in Massachusetts are independents. That's a wild number. 9% are Republicans, and 30% are Democrats. So that is highlighted in what I would call the 495 Beltway that I represented for 20 years, Milford, Bellingham, and those communities. They are not wound up in the old politics of Democrat-Republican in Massachusetts. Theirs is a more independent position, so they feel comfortable voting for Elizabeth Warren and Charlie Baker. You see that there's a bit of a divergence there.
Right.
And
Right.
I think that in this campaign, hold me to that 30% number.
Okay.
Because even if that dips to 20%, that is a huge number of Republicans who say that if he's convicted of any crime between now and November, they will not vote for him.
Speaking about elections, I would be remiss if I didn't ask you. Are you running again?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, for sure.
All right.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of discussion at Smokey Joe's about you and running again and what's going to happen, which, by the way, is the political salon of Western Massachusetts
Okay.
now.
I'll take that for granted. But I take these elections very seriously, earnestly, and on to the next round, and feeling pretty good about it. I mean, you pretty good record to run on.
Absolutely. Finally, I don't like to think that the House of Representatives is basically an elementary schoolyard, but sometimes I think it's like an elementary schoolyard. And in this case, it's about this effort to impeach President Biden. I keep seeing these reports and keep reading these reports about there's no evidence. They've done all this investigative work. There's no evidence. There's no smoking gun. There's no gun. There's no nothing. There's not even a table for the gun to be on. So,
there's certainly no body.
Right, and to me, this is like, all right, this is like grade school. You know, you've done something to me. Now I'm going to do that back to you. And how much of this is a diversion from actual work, the actual work for Congress, for the American people?
It's a significant diversion. And let me castigate the Republicans on the Ways and Means Committee for even participating in this nonsense. There is no role for the Ways and Means Committee during an impeachment process. That belongs to the Judiciary Committee and the Oversight Committee. Nothing to do with the Ways and Means Committee. The fact that the chairman of our committee would immerse himself in the undertaking of a prospective impeachment, it's a bad precedent, and I have pointed that out publicly time and again. Now, to your broader point, disinformation is now part of the campaign cycle.
Right.
And it's not limited to the right in America. Mm-hmm. It's embraced by the left more and more as well. So there's a difference between misinformation and disinformation. Look, you're a longtime journalist. Weapons of mass destruction? Win-Ho Lee? Richard Jewell?
Yeah.
I mean, you look back at this and you say to yourself that facts are facts. Whether or not it was misinformation or disinformation, historians are going to debate, but I think with misinformation, that's an honest mistake.
Right.
Disinformation is a purposeful effort.
It's calculated.
To delude the public and the voters. And it's more and more a part of where we find ourselves in the political system. And it comes from those who only want to tell part of a story. I was reading this fascinating piece about a month ago that I've been recommending to people, and it was a story about memes and Donald Trump and who does some of his characterizing of events. And they interviewed a fellow who's in charge of it. And as usual, it's one person sitting in front of a computer with a handful of, allies. And they said to him, does it bother you that what you're doing is not factual, that it's wrong? And with an honest expression, he said, well, it doesn't have to be honest or true. It just has to go viral.
Right.
I mean, this is where we find ourselves. So fact-based considerations and conversations, we rely more upon what I would consider to be seasoned journalists. They've got to get it right for the American people. Look, in America, media, they're the referee. They're going to catch a curveball from time to time, but back to misinformation versus disinformation. Misinformation you can correct.
Right.
Disinformation tends to be malicious in nature and characterized by, in my judgment, ill-considered means. But we're up against it all of the time. And I think that one of the reasons I still like legacy media, I think these are people that have staked a career and reputation on getting it right. And even when they make a mistake from time to time, they didn't do it because they were guided by malice. So I look at, I would just recommend, because I know you're a reader, just finishing up Adam Nagorny's book about the New York Times.
Okay.
And it comes on the heels of Gay Talese's famous book about the kingdom and the power. And they still set the table in so many ways for what we talk about in America every day. Because they have a large number of reporters still. They have a business model that continues to at least break even, if not make money. And they have reporters in every nook and cranny. But when you look inside the battles that take place in a newsroom, there are still plenty of reporters out there that think getting it right is more important than getting it first.
Right. Yep. I'll go along with that.
Yeah.
Well, folks, this has been a quick half hour, as always, with Congressman Neal. I want to thank you very much for coming in today.
Anytime I can use complete sentences to make an argument, I enjoy the questions.
Well, I actually, being part of that legacy media, I actually like complete sentences from politicians. To me, there's a lot more meat to that than just tossing out 5 words as a soundbite. But thank you very much for coming in today.
Great to see you, Mike.
And thank you very much for tuning in to Focus Springfield.